Welcome. I'm your host, Malcolm Gallagher, from our BizVision studios in the UK. You're watching the BVTV Today's Leader channel. Now, the title of this BVTV channel is deliberate in its naming of Today's Leader. We live in a constantly disruptive business environment and in an altered world. In many ways, as McKinsey said, in the last 10 months, we've moved forward 10 years, especially in technology. Today's leaders need to be equipped with the strategies and the tools that will make them and their businesses fit to compete in this new environment. My guest today is at the sharp end of a dynamic strategy that can be leveraged for better margins in these times. He's the author of the book, The Carrot and the Stick, Leveraging Strategic Control for Growth. Let's meet Dr. William Putsis. Welcome, Bill.
Malcolm, thank you. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's really good. Hey, listen, couldn't you buy some more modern books than those that are behind you?
We're talking about strategy in the future, so we always learn from the past.
Yeah, well, that's
right?
it's a very good point. I suppose the, what's that one? The Art of War and people like that are still relevant, aren't they? Now, just tell us where you are so that we all get envious.
I'm right now physically in the town of Holden Beach, North Carolina, which is halfway between Wilmington, North Carolina, and the South Carolina border on the East Coast of the United States.
Ah, beautiful area, isn't it? Beach close by, is it?
The beach is literally, if I walked around behind me and showed you the window, we'd have a view of the ocean, which is today sunny and nice, rainy tonight, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, yeah. Don't think I'm that too envious because it's sun shining here in northeast of England. And I'll repeat that again in case you think I'm lying. It's sunshine here in northeast of England. Bill, I'm delighted you've kindly agreed to guest today on our BBTV Today's Leader channel, especially about such an exciting strategy that you're proposing. Viewers and listeners, in this BBTV show, I'll be talking to Bill in my usual three parts. First, I'll ask him what he believes are the three competitive challenges that businesses face in today's fluid market. And in part two, we'll move to talking about the carrot and the stick strategy he proposes. And in part three, I'll be asking him how a business can implement it and leverage it. Before we start though, Bill, can you please give us a brief interview of who you are, your area of work, and what brought you to writing the book?
Malcolm, happy to. I'll try and give you the short version rather than the long one, but I'm an economist by training. I have my PhD in economics. I went to school at Cornell, both my master's and PhD from Cornell University. I actually started my career out in General Motors in industry, and then went back to Cornell on the economics faculty. And then I eventually went and joined the business school faculty at the Yale School of Management, where I was full-time for 7 years, and then moved to London, where I chaired at least the marketing faculty for a number of years at the London Business School. Miss London, Miss the UK, as I mentioned to you earlier, came back to the United States and have been teaching at the Keenan Flagler School at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I also teach in executive programs at both the Yale School of Management and at Duke CE. So in addition to all of that, I have my own consulting firm, Chestnut Hill Associates, that I've worked for 25 years with leading companies, small and large, across the world on multiple continents, implementing what I write about in the two books that I have, most recent, Carrot and the Stick. That's the short version of the long one.
Yeah, I like that you're actually implementing what you talk about, because so many people don't, do they? They write about it and say, well, I don't know how to do it.
What's interesting, Malcolm, because I think there is a dichotomy. There are many people who are the academics who go out there and write about it after studying, but have never really done much implementing it. On the other side, there are the people who try to implement, don't have the rigor or the background that sometimes is needed to understand some of the dynamics that happen in the marketplace.
Yeah. But let's start our talk in part one. I know there are many, but what do you think are the top three key competitive challenges that business leaders face in today's fluid market and altered world?
So given that you've asked me to limit it to three, I might put three with a sub, which make it four, I guess. Number one, above all else, is you mentioned in the introduction, accelerating trends. So how do we stay ahead of trends and actually shape and lead them was above all else number one. So many companies were left flat-footed coming in to the pandemic, and when things changed so rapidly to a digital remote environment, they were left behind the curve. I worked with and did a webinar on one of the grocery retailers here in the United States, Kroger, and they actually had already done a lot of home delivery, as I know is quite common in the UK. I remember Tesco getting home delivery back in 2001, so 20 something years ago or 20 years ago. And so the companies that were poised to do that were able to adapt very quickly. Today, companies that have either led in that area, and we're sitting here on Zoom being one of those companies, are in good position to move forward. So number one, above all else, I'd say, how do I stay ahead of the trends, and how do I catch up if I haven't already been on the forefront? So that's number one. Number two is, now by the way, that's not new, but it's certainly, as you mentioned, been accelerated.
Do you mean catch up or jump ahead?
Ideally jump ahead, but the old saying, well, you have to walk before you can learn to run. And some of these companies are behind in many ways. I always look at the example. This is, I know, a number of years ago, but BlackBerry used to be the number one operating system, and in less than 5 years, they went from a larger market share than Apple and Samsung combined to 1%. That's how quickly things change, and it's been accelerated, obviously, by the pandemic.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, okay, I've got that one.
So that's number one. Number two is one that's always there, and that's growth. Jack Welch once said, if the rate of change outside of your organization is slower, is faster than the rate of change inside your organization, the end is in sight. It's just a matter of when. Because everyone's growing faster than me. So growth is something that every company is looking to do. In today's global environment, as we've moved to a digitized world where, in essence, global competition has increased even more than it did before the pandemic, the ability to grow now doesn't mean just grow locally. It means growing internationally. And if you're concentrated in the local market, you now face threats from outside of your local geographic area in ways that have been happening for 25 years, certainly, but have accelerated in the past year and change.
Do you subscribe to that thinking that some academics have here in the UK, that growth is only when you're 20% plus on year?
So I think it depends on the market. It depends on the economy. It depends on the geographic scale and the segments in which you're looking at. We do an old PCG matrix, it used to be called the portfolio matrix, and they have on one axis, it is relative market share, and the other axis is growth. Well, the midpoint of that growth is not zero. The midpoint of that growth isn't 20%. The midpoint of that growth is what is the average growth rate in your sector or segments in which you're operating. So I would argue it's very relative to your competitors in the markets that you're looking at.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Got that one.
And by the way, Matt, I'll say one other quick point about that. As an economist, one always looks at profitability. And so as an economist, you think about growth as being secondary to the bottom line in the short run. The problem with that is as others grow more quickly than you do, if they are, you end up in a disadvantaged cost position over time, and it becomes more difficult to hit sustainable growth targets if you're not in position. Okay.
And growth isn't just about finding more customers, though. It could be productivity, couldn't it? It could be, selling more to an existing customer.
Absolutely. And so growth can take on many facets in today's world with accelerating trends. That first one, as you again mentioned in the introduction, growth in many cases can be delivering in a different way through a different channel that we've never seen before. And think about companies here in the United States, from Amazon to Zoom to Netflix, and the availability of them to grow so quickly, and its new subscribers and existing subscribers both.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay.
And so the third is going to be the one with a subpart to it.
Right. Okay.
And the third, again, we always have to manage risk in fluid, dynamic, and rapidly changing markets today, affected often by what's going on in global markets. So some of the banking woes that we've seen in the past couple of days, people have speculated that the contagion is limited, where in previous crises. We've had small, seemingly small little events have global ripples and affect the world economy. I don't think we'll see that here now. But I would argue for businesses small and large, there should be two big lessons that come out of the last year to help mitigate risk moving forward. Number one is the notion of during pro-cyclical environments, when the economy is growing, the number one objective should be to be liquid. So the idea in many ways, as the economy grows, companies, small businesses, hoard cash, larger businesses move to a more liquid position so that when there is a downturn, you're able to not only survive that downturn, but take advantage of it. So when I look at the Great Recession back in the year 2000, Boeing went into that. The Boeing company, one of my clients, went into it with $65 billion in cash. Right. They came out of the Great Recession with zero. And it's not because they spent it all, it's they bought companies on the cheap when it was the opportunity to do just that. So getting liquidity to mitigate risk moving forward of any downturn is a big part of it. The second, as we start to think about it, we know from studies both in Europe and in the United States that during times of a downturn, the last year, going back to the Great Recession, that about 75 to 85% of customers who move to a low-priced alternative never to being defined as a 5-year period, never come back to the higher-priced alternative. They learn it's good enough. And so if we think about the ways in which you want to mitigate risk in today's environment, is you really do need to be gaining share in order to make sure that you don't lose those favorable positions moving forward in the event there is a recession. Be prepared for something, even if it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Do you subscribe to that concept that obviously agility is important within what you've just been talking about there, but being pre-adaptive rather than, sort of working to adapt your business before it's happening upon you?
Malcolm, great point. And it's funny because I mentioned it before this. We did a webinar a while back with a couple executives at Kroger, along with a colleague of mine. And it's interesting because trends that we see in Europe are just now starting to come to the United States. So a colleague of mine is from the Netherlands, and they use gas stations, which have been declining in presence for drop-off locations of online orders of groceries.
Yeah.
Kroger had already had that in place, but it just wasn't very popular. So your point is a really good one. You need to be pre-adaptive. You need to think about those businesses that are declining. I look at, for example, men's razors in the United States in particular, not just in the United States, but globally. Bic and Schick and a couple others had a dominant market share for many, many years, and they were just ripe for disruption. And so you need to be thinking about where those disruptions are coming from before they happen. I always look at Jeff Bezos, long before he stepped down as the CEO of Amazon, was asked, "Are we being disrupted?" And his response is, I know we're being disrupted. Every company on the planet is being disrupted. My job is to stay ahead of the curve so that we don't get disrupted until after I'm dead. I mean, literally, that's what he said.
Yeah.
So absolutely, Malcolm. Great point.
Excellent. Right. Thank you. I just love that concept of thundering horses, by the way. That makes you move, doesn't it? Get on with it. They're coming behind you. But Bill, before we move to part two, I'd like to remind viewers and listeners of your URL, of your website, which is all the W's. Viewers, you can see it on the screen behind me, obviously, there. All the W's Putsis, Putsis, Putsis.com. Bill, what's the URL of your website, of your consulting company?
Oh, thank you for asking. And it's pretty straightforward. Chestnut Hill Associates.
Chestnut Hill Associates.com. Okay. Now,
all one word.
All one word, yeah, with all the W's beforehand, But if you do go on, if Putsis is easy enough, you can then link through and everything. Bill's book is available now, published by Rotman UTP Publishing. And again, the title is The Carrot and the Stick, Leveraging Strategic Control for Growth. And I'm working my way through it, Bill, It's keeping me awake at night, but, it's your fault.
Well, I love, as you know, Malcolm, from starting the book, I love telling stories.
Yes, And that's what I love about it. Yes, yeah. It's time for part two. Now, we're all familiar with the old adage about using the carrot and a stick for supposedly motivating people. That's an out of date and wrong move in my mind. But you propose the carrot and the stick in a new and refreshing way. So tell us about it and how you demonstrate it in the book.
So obviously the carrot and the stick, Malcolm, there are two parts, the carrot and the stick. I'll start with the stick first, because I think that's the thing that sticks with people most. The stick is something I call strategic control points. They are something that is in limited supply, maybe company's own critical key ingredient. It could be a patent, although it these days is usually not a patent. It could be a key resource or input. And I'll tell two quick stories. The one will be a little bit longer. The second one will be shorter, that illustrate the principle of the stick. There was a company up in Minnesota. It was called Minnetonka Corporation back about 25 years ago. And they wanted to introduce what we now know as commonplace liquid soap, the pump soaps that we all use to wash our hands. Well, it wasn't commonplace back in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
Yeah.
And they had this product. It was, Malcolm, was a great name. Now, I'm being sarcastic because it doesn't exactly roll off your tongue. The name of the product was Creme de la Soap on Tap. Now, soft soap is a much better name, but they wanted to go national with it. And so what do you do if you want to go national as a small little company? Well, even if you get on the shelves of the supermarket, you run into the problem of you alert the big players in the market, the Colgate, Unilevers, Johnson & Johnsons of the world, to come in, swamp you with advertising and shelf space and push you out of the market. And all you've done is alert them to a new opportunity.
Yeah.
So they figured if they had at least a year to keep the big players out, they could build up enough shelf space allocation and brand recognition, even if the big players came back in, that they'd be able to survive with maybe, 35% market share. So the question is how could they keep the big players out of the market? They couldn't patent liquid soap. Liquid soap was first patented in the late 1890s. It was long since it's expired.
Yeah.
And so they went out and this is the way they kept them out. It was absolutely brilliant. They went out and bought the world supply of pumps.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And at that point, pump production wasn't that high. And so they literally went out and sourced every factory they could find that was making a pump and bought out a year's supply.
Yeah.
And it took the big players a year to build factories to make pumps and soap, reverse engineer it, get it on the shelf. And they ended up, once the big players came in a year later, with about a steady state 30% market share. And 2 years later, they sold the company to Colgate-Palmolive to the tune of 1.7 billion US dollars.
Wow.
That's an example of a point of strategic control from a small company. It was the pumps. They weren't in the pump business.
No,
they were in the soap business. But in their chain of production, it was something that was in limited supply. When I worked with Owens Corning, they make roofing shingles here in North America, and granules, the little thing that go on top, were in short supply. And so they were worried that someone would hold them hostage and get a lion's share of the revenue. The other example I'll give really quickly, and this goes to Google, now Alphabet, but it was late 2017, and I'm in Miami, and I'm giving a talk, and a gentleman comes up to me, because I was talking about Google at the time, and he was the CEO of the second largest insurance company in Latin America. And he says, "I hate Google." I said, "Well, that's pretty harsh. Tell me why." He says, "Because they're extorting money out of me." And I said, "Well, can you tell me more, please?"
Yeah.
He says, "In my home country, they know that driver A drives about 10 miles an hour over the speed limit every day. Driver B never stops at stop signs. Driver C drives too close to the car in front of them, while driver D is a really good driver." And they know that because over 90% of the phones has the Android operating system and/or their Google Maps app. And they know the location of everyone who has that on their phone. And he says, "Worse yet, if I don't pay up, they're going to sell it to my rival. So I don't have a choice, because then my rival will be in a better position than I will." The location data coming off the phone is a point of strategic control for Alphabet in that market. Again, Alphabet isn't in the insurance business, but now they're able to get money from the insurance business because they own that point of strategic control. So that's the stick. So the key is trying to find that stick for your market. And in the book, I go through a very specific step-by-step process about how you would align it. Not every industry has one, but to the extent you can find one, and every good large company today has found one. Amazon, Apple, You look at Alphabet, as I mentioned before, part of their, if not much of their success is owed to owning and knowing with foresight that point of strategic control. And there are many other examples I talk about in the book. All right, so that's one, that's the stick.
Yeah.
The carrot part, if they go hand in hand, can be incredibly effective.
Oh, by the way, Bill, I hope these are organic carrots. You know, we've got to stay in.
Yeah. That's great. So in the book, by the way, Malcolm, I have a chapter where it talks about the financial rewards to this. So companies, at least in the S&P 500 in the United States, that use both the carrot and the stick effectively over an 8-year period, more than double their EBITDA and their earnings, and more than double the return on net assets. Companies that did poor on both actually saw their earnings decline over the same period.
Right. Yeah.
So this is material to firm performance. So let me quickly tell you, I know, good use of hopefully good use of your time, the carrot part. And the carrot is what I call vertically aligned incentives. It comes from Oliver Williamson, who won a Nobel Prize on something called asset specificity in economics a number of years ago. And it's actually much simpler than it sounds by my initial description. And it's, by the way, it's the heart of what companies now do and should do if they do it well in supply chain and Internet of Things. And the story is one of Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble, I actually spent a year with them in Cincinnati in the world headquarters. And at the time, they had just set up the first inventory management system with Walmart, which is their largest customer. It's now commonplace in retailing throughout. But the short version of the longer story is that what Procter & Gamble was able to do is to propose an inventory control system to Walmart that lowered Walmart's inventory holding costs on Procter & Gamble products at the time. Now they no longer hold inventory, but back in the day they did. So Walmart saw its P&G cost decline because their P&G products were now delivered just in time to the store based on the inventory control system. So Walmart saw its effective margins on Procter & Gamble's products go up. So what do they want to do? They want to sell more P&G products. They wanted to put Unilever, Colgate, Palmolive, and Johnson & Johnson products in the back shelf where no one can see them. Yeah. So they took an inventory control system that lowered Walmart's cost for only Procter & Gamble, and they actually took Walmart's incentives to be aligned with theirs. And there are many ways to do it other than inventory control systems, but the notion of taking everyone's incentive structure to be aligned with yours. In this example with Procter & Gamble, Procter & Gamble knew Walmart would do what was in P&G's best interest because given the changing cost structure, it was in Walmart's best interest to do what was in P&G's best interest. So that notion of making the incentives aligned, combined with owning a point of strategic control, I argue is the magic sauce in strategy as you try and address the three things that companies are concerned with, as we talked about earlier: accelerating trends, the notion of growth, and addressing the risk on the downside.
I find that's totally fascinating, Bill. A good few years ago, I was in a bar in a hotel at the airport in Detroit, you know, as you do, waiting for a plane, talking to a guy. And I said, well, what do you do? And he says, I sell donuts to Walmart. I said, well, that's going to be hard because I know how hard they are in buying. He says, no, I've been doing it for nearly 20 years. I said, well, how do you manage? He says, I don't sell donuts. And I thought, well, I've had a couple of Jack Daniels. What's he talking about here? But then he said, I sell, return on shelf space. And donuts are different all over the country, South Carolina to North and everything. And I monitor that. And I talked about how we can maximize and get a better return. And they just let me get on with putting whichever donuts in. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, really. And that's exactly the point. So he's found for Walmart, they care about maximizing the returns on each inch of shelf space and efficiency. And he found that their incentives aligned with his if he presented the right way. That's brilliant. Great story.
Yeah. Thanks, William. Now for part 3. Strategies are wonderful things, aren't they? But it's reckoned that around 90% of them never get executed. What a waste. How do you suggest a business goes about implementing and leveraging your carrot and stick strategy?
Another great question. So I'm going to answer it in 2 parts, Malcolm. So number 1 is the notion of, in the book, I actually literally walk through step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. I'm not pitching the book, but it is, and I have videos online if people want to find it, just Google me. But the point of that is that, 1, you got to know what your point of strategic control would be. You have to know what incentives may be misaligned in your industry or in your company. So the first step would be getting a clear picture of what that is. Sometimes it can decimate a company. I worked with a company in the United States a couple of years ago who there was a company in France that was a key supplier. I talk about it in the book. They owned a point of strategic control, and they squeezed the company that I was working with for 3 years. Almost all of the profits had been given to the supplier because they owned and held on tightly as they should. If I were they, I'd be doing the same thing. That point is strategic control. So thinking with foresight, how you look at what I call a value chain, a competency map, and then actually do the hard work to do the analysis. It's logical, but it takes the discipline. So that's number one. The second part, which in some ways I think is almost as important, is not doing it sitting at a desk or on a whiteboard by yourself or in a small team. Yeah. So I'm working with a company now. I do a lot of work in game theory, applied game theory. That is, how do we incentivize our competition to do what we want them to do? And how do we anticipate what reactions might be in what it is that I'm planning on doing? I worked with Heinz in the UK, for example, to look at some of the things that were being suggested to them. But with this one company that I'm talking about, though, what we're doing is we're being all inclusive in the development strategy. So instead of having the senior strategy team or the C-suite or senior executives do the strategy, we now have a team of over 50 people. I believe really strongly, and this is what I talk about in a lot of what I do, is and no offense to consultants, but there is an old joke about consultants that what consultants want. Definition of consultant is someone who steals your watch and wants to sell it back to you over and over again.
Yeah.
And what I like to say when I work with organizations is my goal is to have them not need me anymore.
Work your way out of a job. Work your way out of a job.
In the last, no, in some sense, Malcolm, if you think about it this way, this group, for example, 50 people will have the skill set that I've taught them in this process. They can teach everyone else and be the leaders teaching leaders in their organization. So I can come in and work with them for a couple months. And then next time they need to do the same dang thing, they don't need me anymore. That's the goal. And so that does two things. One, it empowers your people to get the skill set. And then number two, it gives them the ability to buy in. If you're part of that team that developed the strategy, you're now ready and motivated to make it work, because it doesn't work. It's your tail on the line. It's your group that came up with it. And so I believe really strongly is the way you implement it, one, is by following the process. And it's not rocket science, but it is a very ordered and logical process, and you need to follow that process. And then number two, engendering buy-in of the people that will be implementing it by being as broad as you possibly can in the functional areas and bringing in as many people as you can so that they learn the skill set, so becomes, in some sense, part of the company's culture to make it happen. I'd argue those are the two most important things.
Yeah. Do you think also at this particular time, because we do have churn that's happening, and we do have the unfortunate thing that people are retiring or leaving early or whatever it may be, that businesses take on board what you've taught them there, but also bring in replacement for that person at an early enough stage?
Yeah, so I think it's crucial, and Malcolm, it's a really important point. Thinking about what I just said in terms of having a broad group of, say, 50 people, they're senior and junior. Someone comes and goes, and you're exactly right. The churn and transition is significant in these days. In this time, you and I, when we started out, people typically held 1, 2, 3 jobs over the lifetime. Now it's 1, 2, 3 a years before they start looking for the next one. But if you have enough people at different levels, as you bring new people in, they can learn from what you've done. So I would say, my measure of success with a company is when they don't need me anymore, as I've mentioned. And Owens Corning is an example, longtime client. They stopped needing me anymore because they now knew and it was endemic to the culture and the process. And that's kind of the goal. And I think that's how, in many ways, companies can implement this. If the process is in place and they have new people coming in and you have that churn, you have enough people live to be able to teach others the key elements of it. And the last thing I'll say, which I hadn't thought about, Malcolm, but it's certainly relevant, is today online.
Yeah.
There's so much that can be done. So a lot of what I do, for example, is I supplement work I do with company with asynchronous material that they can access online so that they actually can, if someone new comes on, say, hey, here's the way we do it, go to that video. And then we will help you integrate what you do vis-a-vis what you see online.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and well, I've done over 500 videos like this since last March, which is quite a lot around the world, you know. Yeah, I don't. It goes with the sleepless nights, Bill. But as you quite rightly say, people can then go and watch it and get the thinking and information for you. Let it sink into them, because it, you know, it does need to sink in these times, isn't it? We're a bit resistant to things because of uncertainty, and then they can start to take it on board.
Absolutely. So Malcolm, so to your point, there's an old experiment that was done in psychology many years ago. It's like try and take a 9-digit number and memorize it. And do it one of two ways. One, 30 seconds, just trying to memorize the 9 digits. The second is 15 seconds, go away, do something for a couple minutes, come back 15 seconds later and try and memorize that same 9-digit number. And the repeated experiments, the 15 break 15 is substantially higher recall than the 30 seconds at one go. And people in the psychology field postulate that the reason why is when you go and take a break, what is in short-term memory starts to move to long-term memory. So I always believe seeing things at least a second time reinforces what you've heard before and sometimes gives you a different angle that you hadn't thought about before. If we do it live, you don't get a second chance.
No.
If we have the material online, you can go back and say, what was he talking about? I don't get that.
Yeah.
And goes back, and then it reinforces the material for a second time in addition to giving you those new and fresh insights. So I'm a big believer in a combination of what we do offline and online. So we need to have some face-to-face, and fortunately, I think we're moving more and more to a world where it's a blended view of the two. And I think that's one good thing that has come out of the pandemic.
Yes, I quite agree with you. And the hybrid, that sort of hybrid approach there just allows somebody to learn at their pace as well, doesn't it? You know, okay, I'll play that again. I'll play that again. As I've heard from a number of our viewers and followers, you know, I watched that again, Malcolm. You know, and I got it the second time. You know, as well, I'm just the same. I'll be watching you again a few more times, as well as finishing the book. I started today's interview off by talking about our aim with today's Leader channel. I trust you feel we've truly met that aim for you with this very insightful interview with Dr. William Putsis. Let's call him Bill, should we? Author of The Carrot and the Stick. Thank you, Bill, for a great interview.
Malcolm, thank you. Insightful questions, great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.